I never thought much about the history of my apartment building when I first moved in. It was just another old place in the French Quarter of New Orleans, you know. Creaky floors peeling paint, that musty smell that seems to seep into everything down here. But man, if I'd known then what I know now, I wouldn't have signed that lease for all the beignets in the world. It started about 3 months after I moved in. I was up late one night, binging some true crime show on Netflix when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the TV, so I hit mute. But there it was again, this faint whisper coming from somewhere outside my apartment. Now, living in the quarter, you get used to all sorts of noises. Drunk tourists, street performers, the occasional jazz funeral. But this was different. It was like someone was having a conversation just on the other side of my wall, but I couldn't make out the words. I got up, thinking maybe it was my neighbors. But as I moved around my apartment, I realized the sound was coming from the emergency stairwell. You know, one of those old wooden ones that every ancient building seems to have. I pressed my ear against the door, and I swear, it sounded like multiple voices, all whispering at once. But here's the thing, when I opened the door, it just stopped. Nothing but the usual creaks and groans of the old building settling. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just tired. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Always late at night, always from the stairwell. And each time, it seemed to get a little louder, a little clearer. I started asking around, you know, trying to see if anyone else had heard anything weird. Most of my neighbors just shrugged it off. It's New Orleans, honey. Weird is what we do. But Mrs. Thibodeau, this sweet old lady who lived in the building for like 50 years, she got real quiet when I mentioned it. You be careful poking around in things you don't understand, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. This building, it's got history. Not all of it good. That should have been my cue to back off, right? But no, I had to go and play detective. I started digging into the building's history, and let me tell you, Mrs. Thibodeau wasn't kidding. Turns out, back in the 1920s, this place used to be a speakeasy. And not just any speakeasy, it was run by some pretty nasty characters who didn't take kindly to snitches or rivals. The more I dug, the worse it got. There were stories of people disappearing, of bodies being hidden in the walls. And guess where they supposedly did most of their dirty work? Yep, that creepy old stairwell. I tried to tell myself it was all just urban legends, you know. The kind of stories people make up to scare tourists. But then, about a week after I started my research, things got intense. It was around a.m., and I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it. Not just whispers this time, but full-on voices. They were muffled, like they were coming from far away, but I could make out bits and pieces. Gotta move the body. Boss ain't gonna like this. Shut him up for good. I froze, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination running wild after all that research, but it felt so real. And then I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps coming up the stairs. I don't know what possessed me, but I got out of bed and crept to my door. With shaking hands, I opened it just a crack and peeked out into the hallway. The stairwell door was open, and I swear to God, I saw a shadow move across the wall. But it wasn't just any shadow, it was huge, distorted, like something out of a nightmare. I slammed my door shut and locked it, then shoved my dresser in front of it for good measure. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my room, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager and demanded to know if there had been any maintenance work done overnight. He looked at me like I was crazy and said no one had been in the building. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I packed up and moved out right then and there. But I didn't. I stayed, partly out of stubbornness, partly because I couldn't afford to break my lease. And the whispers? They kept coming, night after night. I've tried everything: earplugs, white noise machines, even a Ouija board once. Big mistake, by the way. Nothing helps. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy. Other times, I'm sure that this building, this city, is trying to tell me something. But do I really want to know what it is? All I know is, I don't go near that stairwell anymore. And if you ever find yourself in a creaky old building in New Orleans, and you hear whispers in the night, take it from me, don't listen. Some secrets are better left buried in the past. If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. It all started on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd just gotten home from work, kicking off my shoes at the door like always. My house wasn't anything special, just a single-story place with a decent-sized garden that I'd been pretty proud of. Lots of native plants, a small veggie patch, that sort of thing. I'd spent countless weekends getting it just right. As I was heating up some leftovers for dinner, I glanced out the kitchen window. That's when I saw them. Shoe prints. Right there in the freshly turned soil of my garden bed, leading straight up to my bedroom window. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I mean, who'd be creeping around my garden, right? But when I went outside to check, there they were. Clear as day. Size 11, I reckon. Definitely not mine. I called the police, of course. They came out, took some photos, asked a few questions. But without any other evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Probably just some kids mucking about, they said. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But the next night, the prints were back. And they were closer. I couldn't sleep after that. Every little noise had me jumping out of bed, heart pounding. I'd rush to the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But there was never anyone there. Just those damn footprints in the morning, a little closer each time. I started setting up traps. You know, like in those old cartoons? Only instead of a net and a carrot, I used fishing line and bells. Strung them up all around the garden. Figured if someone was creeping about, I'd hear them. But nothing. Night after night, nothing. Yet every morning, those prints would be there. Closer and closer to my window. I became obsessed. Installed security cameras, motion sensor lights, the works. My beautiful garden turned into a high-tech fortress. My neighbors started giving me weird looks when I'd be out there at all hours, checking and rechecking everything. "You all right, mate?" Old Mr. Johnson from next door asked one day. "You're looking a bit rough." I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed and unshaven. But how could I explain that every night someone was getting closer and closer to my bedroom? That I was terrified of the moment when those prints would finally reach my window. It went on for weeks. I barely slept, barely ate. My work started to suffer. I was jumping at shadows, seeing threats everywhere. The cops stopped taking my calls seriously. Even I was starting to doubt myself. Then, one night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. My heart nearly stopped. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. I grabbed the cricket bat I'd started keeping by my bed and crept towards the sound. As I rounded the corner to my living room, I saw him, a figure, hunched over by the broken window. I flicked on the lights, bat raised, ready to defend myself. But it wasn't some masked intruder. It was Mr. Johnson, my 70-year-old neighbor looking confused and terrified. Turns out, the poor bloke had early-stage dementia. He'd been sleepwalking, following the same path through my garden night after night. When I'd fortified the garden, he'd just found new roots. That night, in his confused state, he'd finally made it to the house and accidentally broken the window. The relief I felt was immense, but so was the shame. I'd let my fear turn me into a paranoid mess. I'd seen a stalker where there was just a sick old man who needed help. It's been years now, but I still think about those weeks sometimes. How fear can twist your perception, make you see threats where there are none. Mr. Johnson's family got him the care he needed, and I've tried to be a better neighbor since then. I never thought much about the supernatural until I bought that house in Portland. It was a real find, a sleek, mid-century modern gem with clean lines and huge windows. It needed some updating, but I was excited about the project. The first few weeks were great. I was busy fixing up the place, getting to know the neighborhood. But then I started hearing things. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe mice in the walls. But it got worse. One night, I was in the basement, checking out the old boiler system, when I noticed something odd about one of the wood-paneled walls. It didn't quite line up with the rest of the room. I tapped it, and it sounded hollow. Curious, I started prying at the edges, and suddenly, a whole section of the wall slid open like a secret door. The smell hit me first. It was musty, like old books left in a damp cellar. I shined my flashlight into the opening, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the darkness, I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the concrete floor, the beam sweeping across the creature. Just for a second, I caught a glimpse of gray, leathery skin and long, spindly limbs. Then it was gone, retreating into the shadows. I slammed the hidden panel shut and ran upstairs, my heart pounding. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bedroom, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. The next day, I did some digging. Turns out, the house used to belong to a guy named Elliot Blackwood back in the 1960s. He was into some weird stuff, occult practices, and the like. People in town still whispered about him. I wanted to forget about what I'd seen, convince myself it was just my imagination. But things kept happening. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. I'd catch glimpses of something dark scurrying just out of sight. And the dreams. God, the dreams were the worst. Every night, I'd find myself back in that hidden room. The creature would be there, whispering things I couldn't quite understand. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something was watching me from the shadows. I started losing track of time. I'd blink, and suddenly hours had passed. My friends stopped calling. I lost my job, but I couldn't leave the house. Something was keeping me there. One day, I found myself in the basement again, standing in front of that hidden panel. I don't remember going down there. My hand was on the edge of the door, ready to slide it open. That's when I snapped out of it. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached my sister's place across town. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I broke down and told her everything. She convinced me to see a therapist. We also brought in a local paranormal investigator, though I was skeptical at first. They didn't find any concrete evidence of the creature, but the investigator said she felt a negative energy in the basement. I ended up selling the house. I couldn't bear to go back there, even to pack up my things. My sister handled all of that for me. It's been a few years now. I'm doing better, but I still have nightmares sometimes. I can't help but wonder about that creature. Was it real? Or was it all in my head? I had just finished a grueling project at work and desperately needed a break. When I found this quaint cabin nestled in the woods near Jackson Hole, it seemed perfect. The photos online showed a cozy interior with rustic charm, and the surrounding landscape was breathtaking. I booked it without hesitation. As I drove up the winding dirt road, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, a small wooden structure with a wraparound porch. I remember feeling a wave of relief as I stepped out of my car, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The property manager had left the key under the mat, as promised. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the lights. The interior was simple but comfortable, a small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, and a bedroom off to the side. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in for the evening. As I was making a cup of tea, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. I paused, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Probably just a mouse, I thought, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. That first night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak and groan. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a loud thump from the living room. My heart racing, I sat up in bed, straining my ears. Silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just the wind and eventually fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke up determined to enjoy my vacation. I made coffee and decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly in the daylight. That's when I noticed something odd. There were small symbols carved into the wooden beams near the ceiling, intricate designs that looked almost like ancient runes. I hadn't noticed them the night before. Curious, I ran my fingers over the markings. They seemed old, the edges worn smooth. As I examined them more closely, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but they made me deeply uncomfortable. Throughout the day, I tried to distract myself by hiking and reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see someone or something staring back at me from the tree line. That evening, as I was making dinner, the lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just faulty wiring, but then they started flickering in a pattern. It was subtle, but unmistakable. My hands shook as I turned off the stove and backed away from the kitchen. I grabbed my phone to call the property manager, but there was no signal. Panic rising in my chest, I decided to leave. I didn't care that it was dark outside. I couldn't stay in that cabin another minute. As I was throwing my things into my suitcase, I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I managed to grab my car keys and bolt out the back door. I drove down that mountain road like a madwoman, not stopping until I reached the town. The local sheriff listened to my story with a mix of concern and skepticism. He told me there had been other reports of strange occurrences at that cabin over the years, but nothing had ever been proven. Apparently, decades ago, there had been a series of disappearances in the area, but the cases were never solved. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.